Michael by R S Holloway, a vampire romance story brought to you by romancely.com. Chapter 1. There was something to be said for working nights. They say the night belongs to the poets and the madmen, but Danielle Rowland had long since learned that's not always the case. In the 4 years since she had got a job at the Wooden Horse public house, she had seen her fair share of poets, madmen, and other specimen. If anything, the variety of people was a welcome distraction from what Danielle felt was somewhat of a dull life. It wasn't that she didn't like Ojai, it was just that, despite its many vibrant qualities, Ojai was still a quiet town, and Danielle was done with quiet. She longed for fulfillment and excitement, for a sense of purpose that she hadn't got to experience as she struggled to find her way while everybody else went ahead and left her behind. She knew she wouldn't find any of that in her hometown, not because it was Ojai, but because it was her hometown. People were meant to explore the world and step out of their comfort zone. Danielle had never even stepped out of the Californian border. She longed for a change of scenery, and the sooner that happened, the better, which was why she had taken up a nighttime weekend job while she also put herself through nursing school. The extra money would help her put Ojai in her rearview mirror sooner rather than later. While she worked to bring her life finally to its starting point, Danielle appreciated the diversity that admittedly stopped by the Wooden Horse, where both the regulars and the newcomers would occasionally make for an interesting night. And yet, for all of the people that she had seen, she strongly suspected no poet or madman could ever be as interesting as the man who had stepped through the doors of the pub about half an hour earlier. She had noticed him immediately. It was impossible not to. Danielle wasn't usually one to notice physical beauty in men, mostly because she knew that the last thing she needed in order to leave Ojai was to fall in love with someone from Ojai. But it was very hard not to do a double take with this man. He wore his blonde hair short and cropped, which made the flawless quality of his features appear even more striking. He had high cheekbones and a chiseled jaw that belonged on the cover of a magazine. Even though he was sitting at a far table from the bar, it was hard not to notice the proud, almost regal way in which he carried himself. He sat with his back straight and his shoulders squared, as if he were ready to take on anything life might decide to throw in his direction. He looked fierce and confident and absurdly handsome, and Danielle was captivated. She spent most of her shift that night throwing looks at the table where the man sat. Their eyes met a couple of times, and then Danielle would quickly look away and feel herself flush scarlet. "Yep, I noticed him too," Jack eventually informed her as he passed her by with a box of imported drafts hauled over his shoulder. Danielle suddenly pretended to be extremely busy making a mojito, even though by that time of night the pub had half emptied and no one had asked for a refill. "Who?" she asked casually. She could almost hear Jack rolling his eyes behind her. "Come on, Danny, spare me the charade. I've seen you looking at him." Next thing Danielle knew, Jack's voice was very close to her ear as he added, "And it's all right, you know. You're allowed to ogle." Danielle pulled away sharply and turned her head to look at her friend in outrage. "I wasn't ogling anyone!" Jack arched a dark eyebrow. "Really?" There was a satisfied smirk on his lips, as if finally catching her in the very human activity of flirting. And oh God, is that what she had been doing? Had made his night. Which probably was exactly the case. A few years older than her and having worked at the pub since his teenage years, Jack had ended up taking Danielle under his wing. They had bonded immediately, and soon enough the man had become a sort of surrogate for the older brother Danielle had never had. He was constantly trying to fix her up with somebody, convinced as he was that resurrecting her love life, or at the very least her sex life, would work wonders for her. "Yes, really," Danielle said, even though she knew she wasn't fooling either of them. "Are you sure you're not interested?" Jack and Danielle understood each other in a way that she had never experienced before meeting him. He could have been the perfect man for her, if only he wasn't gay. "Oh, believe you me, I'm very interested," Jack said, glancing momentarily in the direction of the stranger's table. "But it's not me that he's been eyeing all night." Danielle blinked. What are you talking about? He wants you, Danny. He does not. Really? Then why is he coming over here? Danielle turned around and sure enough, the blonde-haired stranger was walking up to the counter. For some inexplicable reason, her mouth went dry. She hated herself a little for it. She should be getting a grip. After all, it wasn't like she had never seen a handsome man before. Except that, in a way, she certainly had never seen anyone this handsome. If Danielle had noticed his bearing before, now that she had a full-figure view, she could also appreciate the man's body. He was tall and walked with a stride that oozed confidence and relaxation. He was dressed simply, with blue jeans and a black t-shirt that hugged his torso in all the right places. Even through the thin fabric of the cotton, Danielle could tell that he was lithe but muscular. She swallowed hard and tried to get some control back over her inexplicably racing heart. Beside her, Jack snorted. "Yeah, and you're not ogling." He gave her a pat on the shoulder and subtly disappeared to the back of the pub. Danielle didn't have much time to panic over whether the stranger had heard the exchange, because next thing she knew, the man was leaning against the counter and addressing her directly. "Hi," he said. Even his voice was smooth. Danielle cleared her throat. "Hi," she said, and then she was suddenly struck with inspiration as she finally remembered her role. "What can I get you?" "Another pint would be good," the man said, placing an empty glass on the counter. "Please don't bother with a fresh glass. This one will be fine." Danielle eyed him curiously. "All right," she said, uncertain. It was a bit of an odd request, but she complied anyway. "What were you drinking?" "Beamish." Danielle nodded and set out to draw the perfect stout. The wooden horse prided itself in its genuine Irish origins and in being the only pub in town that served actual pints, imported drafts from Europe, and ales from local breweries. "Thanks," the man said, when Danielle set the refilled glass in front of him. She would have expected him to go back to the table from where he had appeared to be people watching for the night, but instead, the man settled himself on a stool at the counter. "Do you mind if I hang out here?" he asked, probably having caught her surprised look. It was starting to get a bit lonely back there. "Sure," Danielle said, as casually as she could. "Make yourself comfortable." The man toasted her with his glass and took a hearty swig. "You draw a very good pint." Danielle smiled, pleased. It had not been an easy thing to learn, and she was particularly proud of how good she had gotten at it. "Thank you." For the next half hour, she tried to think of something, anything to say to this beautiful stranger. As she worked, she tried to come up with conversation topics in her head, or even just opening lines that would not sound awkward, dorky, or downright creepy. But nothing came to mind. On his part, the man didn't seem to mind and appeared perfectly content to just sit in silence, enjoy his impeccably draft beer, and soak in the ambiance and the people. He would continue to look around, sometimes becoming so engrossed in someone that he would blatantly run his gaze over the whole length of their figure. Danielle couldn't tell who this man was really interested in, if women or men. He seemed equally fascinated by both sexes. "So?" Jack asked when she appeared in the back, having left another of their co-workers to man the bar for a while. "Have you chatted him up yet?" Danielle shrugged. "Not really." Jack looked up from the newly arrived shipment of wines he was sorting through. "What do you mean, not really?" Danielle looked away briefly, embarrassed. "I don't know what to say to him." "For Christ's sake, Danny!" Jack cried in exasperation. "Just say anything. Ask him where he's from, what he does, anything. Chances are he's not interested in conversation anyway." "Yeah, that's the other thing," Danielle said. She chose to ignore the fact that she felt like an idiot for not having come up herself with such simple, casual questions as those Jack had just suggested. What was it about this guy that short-circuited her brain, anyway? "He seems to be looking for something, someone." Jack frowned. "What do you mean?" "Well, he has checked out a few people here and there." "So?" Jack was watching her in confusion, and Danielle knew then that her friend didn't get it. "So he's probably looking for a one-night stand." Again, so? Danielle rolled his eyes. I'm not interested. Oh, come on, Jack laughed. You never were such a prude. It's not about that, Danielle said. It's just that he was looking around as if he was in a meat shop or something. And you're not just a piece of meat? Jack guessed. Exactly. It made her uncomfortable, the way the man had been studying a few of the people in the pub that night. He wasn't necessarily doing it in a creepy way, but he also appeared to be looking for something specific. Danielle couldn't put her finger on it, but it made her uneasy. On the other hand, she also felt drawn to this stranger in a way that she had not felt drawn to anybody in a very long time. I guess there's no harm in at least talking to him, she heard herself say, thinking out loud. Jack lit up instantly. Good girl, he said. Maybe you'll at least get an interesting conversation out of it, and if he turns out to be an asshole, you can always kick him out. Danielle smiled uncertainly. They both knew she wasn't the kicking out type. She couldn't even send back soup in restaurants. All right then, she said after a moment. I'm going back out there. You do that, Jack said. And remember, keep it simple. Where are you from? What do you do? Danielle nodded, once again wondering why she hadn't thought of those easy conversation starters before. But when she went back to the bar, she was disappointed to find that the man had left. The glass was empty and there was a bill stuck under it. Danielle looked around and tried to tell whether anyone else was missing that had been in the pub before. She shook her head at herself as soon as she realized what she was doing. Why did she care who this man went home with? Why did the thought of him in bed with someone make her feel so uncomfortable? Could one even be jealous of a stranger? The rest of the night passed by incredibly slow. Danielle couldn't explain it. Even on slow nights, she usually enjoyed working at the pub enough that time would pass quickly. Tonight, the 2 hours separating her from the end of her shift felt like 2 days. She just couldn't get the blonde stranger out of her head, and that was in itself extremely weird. Men rarely caught her interest these days, and even those who did so for a few fleeting moments. This man seemed to be sticking. Already he was getting into Danielle's thoughts and under her skin alarmingly fast. There had been something about him. Sure, he was gorgeous, but it was more than that. Again, Danielle couldn't put her finger on it, but whatever it was, it must be something good, for this guy to still be on her mind. The more Danielle tried to tell herself that it had just been another brief encounter with a random patron, the more she found herself unable to really believe it. She wasn't sure whether she would ever see that man again, but she knew deep down that meeting him had not been an ordinary occurrence. Jack tried to make her talk about it a couple of times, but to her friend's credit, he quickly desisted, and that worried Danielle more than anything. How out of it must she look for Jack to relent so uncharacteristically? When 2 o'clock finally struck and the pub finally closed, Danielle set out to perform her cleanup duties with renewed purpose. The faster she tidied up the place, the sooner she could get out of there. Perhaps a change of setting was all she needed to get the stranger out of her mind. 40 minutes later, after she had said goodnight to Jack and walked out of the back door, her thoughts had not changed course. They were still on that man who had looked so dazzling and so extraordinary and so out of this world that Danielle still couldn't wrap her mind around it. She was still thinking about him when the voice spoke. "Danielle!" Danielle started and nearly jumped out of her skin, almost dropping the keys to her car in the process. She whirled around, deeply wishing that she had taken her girlfriend's advice and started carrying pepper spray in her purse. She relaxed when she saw the stranger who had stolen her thoughts walking towards her, which, on second thought, was just as baffling as anything else that concerned the guy. Why would she relax upon seeing him? She didn't know the man. Who was to say that he wasn't setting out to attack her? But something in the pit of her stomach told her that she had nothing to fear, and for once Danielle decided not to question it and just relish the relief brought on by the realization that she wasn't about to be attacked by some maniac in a parking lot. "It's Danielle, right?" the man asked as he caught up with her. "I've heard your friend call you." Danielle watched him curiously. Yes," she said, confused. "Can I help you? What are you doing here? Did you forget something inside?" No, the man replied. I mean, yes, in a way. Danielle frowned. I've been wanting to talk to you all night. Danielle arched an eyebrow. And you decided to do it now, in an empty parking lot at the end of my shift? The man cringed and chuckled nervously. Doesn't look good, does it? No, Danielle said, as coolly as she could, even though she found herself fighting off an amused grin. It doesn't. I'm sorry, the man offered. I swear I mean no harm. I just couldn't work up the nerve until now. Danielle stared at him. Did the most gloriously attractive man she had ever seen just admit that he couldn't work up the nerve to talk to her? Are you making fun of me? She blurted out before she could stop herself. The situation just seemed too absurd. The man looked crestfallen. What? No, he said quickly. It's the truth. Admittedly, I could have just come back tomorrow, but I knew that if I didn't talk to you tonight, I would regret it. Danielle watched him warily. What do you want to talk about? The stranger shrugged. Believe it or not, I haven't been able to come up with a topic of conversation. I just know I'd like to get to know you. He sighed and ran a hand nervously through his short blonde hair. Shit, he said, exhaling a frustrated breath. Look, I know I must sound crazy to you, or creepy, or both. He paused, maybe to allow Danielle to jump in and deny it, but Danielle wasn't about to, not just yet. But I've been noticing you all night. I don't normally notice people. I'm a bit of a loner. It's been ages since anyone struck my interest. In spite of her better judgment, Danielle found herself smiling. I think I know how you feel, she admitted. The man looked surprised. Really? Danielle shrugged. I don't usually notice people either, she said. Or rather, I usually don't allow myself to notice them. The stranger cocked his head slightly to the side, appraising her curiously. But you've noticed me? Danielle let out a snort before she could stop herself. It's kind of hard not to, she said. Have you looked in a mirror recently? Something darted across the man's handsome features, a strange look that was gone in a flash. Not recently, no. For a moment, and for some reason, Danielle almost took him literally. So we've noticed each other, the man said. Yeah, Danielle echoed. This was rapidly turning into the strangest conversation she'd ever had. Is that why you came back, to tell me you've noticed me? The man seemed to think about it for a moment. I guess it is, he eventually said. And to ask whether you would be interested in having an actual conversation one of these days, maybe over a beer. Danielle stared at him. Are you asking me out? She must be hearing this all wrong. There was no way a guy like this was going for her. To her astonishment, however, the stranger nodded. I am. We could meet here on your night off, he offered. I realize you don't know me, so it's probably best if we're in a safe, familiar surrounding for you. Even with all the reservations in the world, Danielle had to admit that was pretty thoughtful. I'm off Wednesday night, she said, before she could change her mind. The man lit up. It looked like he had not been expecting her to agree to go out with him, and that was also surprising. Really, who in their right mind would ever refuse a man like this? He pulled a small notebook and pen from his back pocket and scribbled something on it. Here, he said, handing the note to Danielle. This is my number. Danielle took it and looked down at it. Michael? She said, reading the name written above the digits. The man nodded and offered her a pearly, white-toothed smile. I guess we're not strangers anymore. I guess not, Danielle said, returning the friendly gesture. I'll see you here on Wednesday then. Is 6 o'clock good for you? We could have a bite to eat. Jack makes some mean burgers. 8 would be better. Sure, she agreed readily. I'll see you then. And that was that. Her head spun with the night's events. But driving soothed her, and Danielle took the long way home and tried to gather her thoughts. It all felt very surreal. Never in a million years would she have expected a man like Michael to walk into her pub, of all the pubs in Ojai. Never in a million years would she have expected a man like Michael to be interested in her, of all the women in Ojai. After the brief and wonderfully weird exchange in the parking lot, Danielle knew for sure that there was something about Michael. She still couldn't put her finger on it or define it in any way, but she knew that she wouldn't have agreed to go out with him if he had not given her the feeling that he really must be something else. She sighed, still shocked by the fact that she had indeed agreed to go out with the man. After swearing off anything even remotely resembling a date, here she was making plans with a total stranger. What would Jack say? Danielle groaned out loud when she realized she would have to update her friend on what just went down. And speaking of going down, she shook her head, pushing those thoughts very far away. She supposed she couldn't be blamed for fantasizing when it came to a man as utterly drop-dead gorgeous as Michael. It was hard not to try and imagine what his touch on her skin would feel like. Danielle let out another heavy sigh. So much for swearing off men. Chapter 2. In 1715, America was a mess, and the province of Carolina was no exception. People were still trying to find their place in the new continent. Specifically, they were trying to get adjusted to the whole recent North Carolina-South Carolina division. Repercussions from the Tuscarora War were still being heavily felt, while the Yamasee War was just beginning. The pressure from the British Crown was getting to be unbearable. And as if all of that wasn't enough, everyone was still reeling from the mysterious loss of the colony on Roanoke Island, even though it had happened over a century earlier. Michael Williamson was born in that chaos, and he had carried it with him for all of his life, both his mortal existence and his immortal one. The chaos crawled constantly under his skin, patiently waiting to be unleashed. It resided in his bones. It pumped along with the blood in his veins, or at least it did for as long as there was any blood pumping in his veins. It beat alongside his heart, or at least it did for as long as his heart was beating. Now it remained with him, in his nerves and skin and muscles. In his being. Over the centuries, Michael had fed that chaos, sometimes willingly, sometimes without even realizing it. The chaos ruled his very existence. It had always been that way, and that was the reason why his sire had been drawn to him in the first place. Michael's darkness was the thing that had condemned him to a non-life in the real dark. Provided that was really the horrible sentence it was made out to be. While many of his counterparts considered their non-life a curse, Michael could never see it that way. It wasn't that he had not tried, because he had. He had tried very hard too, despise the hand that had been dealt to him, but he could never do it. He could never buy into the resentment, the self-loathing, the misery. He may not necessarily like who he was, but he sure did like what he was. After 300 years on this earth, he was not yet tired of life or of death for that matter. He still craved all that the world had to offer. As far as Michael was concerned, 300 was the new 30. And it really did seem like the world still had something to offer. 3 days after his first encounter with Danielle, he was still unable to get her out of his head. He had been thinking of nothing and no one else since, except for those all-consuming moments when the hunger struck. "Let's go to Ojai," Stephen had said. "Nothing ever happens in Ojai. It'll do you good." Stephen had a way of knowing how to tame Michael's chaos whenever it became too untamable. And so, they had packed their duffel bags and driven from crazy L.A. to tranquil Ojai, in search of that peace that always helped calm Michael's restless nature. A vacation, their very own vampire retreat. Except that something did happen in Ojai. For the first time in over 2 centuries of being a vampire, Michael had met a human that he did not want. There was something about Danielle that turned his hunger off, like somebody had flipped a switch within him. He had been desperately hungry the night he had walked into the pub where she worked, and yet he had not wanted her. He had wanted everyone in that room except for her. The whole phenomenon was puzzling and fascinating. Michael could hear the drumming of her heart and the whooshing sound of the blood in her veins, but he did not thirst for her blood. For the first time in over 2 centuries, he had met someone who didn't make him hungry. If anything, Danielle made his appetite all but disappear. He needed to take a closer look at this woman, who made him as uninterested in feeding on her as in feeding on a plateful of salad. He had walked up to the bar, and she had looked up at him with the bluest eyes he had ever seen, and that's when he knew he had to get to know her. Danielle had delicate Asian features, almond-shaped eyes, and blue irises. The combination was breathtaking. There was something about this woman, and Michael was determined to find out exactly what it was. Which was why he now found himself in front of a mirror that did not show him any reflection. Old habits dye hard trying out shirts that he had no idea what they looked like on him. Hot date? Michael didn't turn around. He had heard Stephen walk into the room seconds ago, and Eli, like all humans, made as much noise as an elephant as he moved around in the kitchen. Sort of, he said vaguely. Are you serious? Michael did turn around then, having finally settled on a black shirt that, he thought, hugged his torso just right and probably made the green of his eyes pop. As a matter of fact, yes, I am, he said. Stephen was watching him with a bemused expression on his face. He had dark eyes and angular but graceful features, and he wore his long dark hair tied up in a carefully messy bun. Half Hawaiian native and half Caucasian, Stephen was a beauty to behold, and he had broken many hearts during both his human life and his existence as a vampire. He had been sired along with Michael, and they had been inseparable since. Of course, they'd had their falling outs during the centuries, and they had spent much time apart as they both tried to figure out who they were, but eventually they always gravitated back to each other. Michael was happy some things did last forever, because he truly couldn't picture himself treading this world without his immortal brother by his side. Stephen was cooler, quieter, more level-headed. He could placate Michael's chaos in ways that Michael himself had never learned how to do. Who is she? Sexuality became a blurry thing for vampires, but Stephen knew Michael still preferred women, just like Michael knew Stephen still preferred men. Her name is Danielle. She works at a pub downtown. Stephen scowled. He was leaning against the doorway, his arms crossed in front of his chest. Michael, we're here to decompress, remember? Don't put yourself on the radar. Michael huffed. It'll be fine. Besides, I'm not going to feed on her. Stephen snorted. I've heard that one before. I mean it. Michael hesitated. I don't want to, he admitted, still quite unable to believe it himself. Stephen's stern scowl morphed into a confused frown. What do you mean? Michael shrugged and crossed the room over to the dresser. He pulled open one drawer and took a necklace out of a small box, placing it carefully around his neck. I don't know, he said. When I look at her, I feel not thirsty. What are you talking about? I've no idea. Stephen stared intently at him. Are you seriously telling me that this woman somehow turns you off? Hunger-wise, yeah, Michael said, because he would have been a fool to be turned off by Danielle sexually. The woman was gorgeous, and he had seen his fair share of gorgeous women over the decades. It's weird, isn't it? I dare say. I asked her out because I want to get to know her better, Michael went on. I want to figure out what's going on. Can't you just... I don't know. Forget about it? Michael raised an eyebrow at his brother. Would you? If you met someone you didn't want to feed on, no appetite whatsoever, would you just forget about it? I suppose not, Stephen conceded. But anyone who turns off vampire hunger can't be hiding anything good. And we're here to stay out of trouble, he said pointedly. Michael gave him a grin that he knew would be infuriating. I'm only buying her a drink, he said, as innocently as he could. I'm going to talk to her a little, and then I'm going to come back here and I'm never going to see her again. That is, provided that I can figure out what's what in only one date. Stephen rolled his eyes. You're impossible. Fine, go, he said, exasperated. But know that if you get yourself into one of your situations, I'm not pulling you out this time. Michael winked at him. Sure you are. He walked past Stephen and squeezed his shoulder as he went by, grinning at his brother's long-suffering sigh. In the kitchen, Eli was busy making dinner that he would eat out of hunger and that Stephen would chew on out of politeness. The smell of cooking meat filled the room. Michael's stomach didn't grumble and his mouth didn't water. I'll be back later, he announced. Eli turned around and gave him a worried look. You'll behave? Michael rolled his eyes. For God's sake, what's with everyone tonight? Yes, I'll behave. I'm not here to cause trouble. It's just, People still know me here, you know? Yes, I know. Don't worry, none of your high school girlfriends are going to end up on my menu. But if you'd be so kind as to point me in the direction of any high school douche that might have bullied you. Eli cringed. God, just get out of here and try not to kill anyone. Michael grinned and all but flew out of the small but very pleasant house they had rented on the green, conveniently isolated outskirts of town. He thought about simply running to the place where he was supposed to meet Danielle, but he figured it would draw less attention if he drove there instead. He climbed into his extremely old, extremely beat-up black Mustang and drove onto the road and later on into the very much reduced traffic. He still wasn't too fond of driving, or of cars for that matter, which was why such a gorgeous model like the car he was driving was also so unkempt. He knew everything that helped to keep up appearances was a good thing, but he still didn't see why they simply couldn't move around, relying solely on the powers that were given to them. It was nice to think about something else other than Danielle for a change, even if it was something as trivial as his issues with modern transportation. Soon, however, his thoughts drifted back to that blue-eyed wonder that made his hunger disappear. Danielle could not remember the last time she had been this nervous. It wasn't just that she hadn't been on a date in what felt like ages. It was also that, A, she wasn't quite sure whether this was an actual date, and B, it was with the strangest, most beautiful man she had ever encountered. There was something about Michael. It went well beyond his striking looks, and Danielle had been trying to put her finger on it since the night she had met him, with no success whatsoever. Now, as she sat at a table in the already busy pub, she told herself that she would get to the bottom of it by the end of the evening. So when's your date getting here? Danielle rolled her eyes. She could actually hear the grin in Jack's voice, and sure enough, when she looked up, her friend was giving her the biggest smirk. It's not a date, isn't it? Danielle hesitated. I don't know. Anyway, he should be here any minute now. Jack's eyes darted to the main door. He better not stand you up. Danielle groaned. Thank you. I hadn't even thought of that. Sorry. Jack gave her a contrite little smile. He patted her shoulder and went back to his work at the bar. The next 15 minutes felt like an eternity, and Danielle passed the time looking around nervously and tearing her paper napkin up to shreds. When Michael finally stepped through the doors of the pub, her heart jumped to her throat. She took a deep breath and willed herself to calm down. Michael spotted her easily and walked up to her table with that easy stride of his that had so impressed her the first time she saw him. Danielle noticed quite a few heads turning and numerous pairs of eyes casting hungry stares up and down Michael's figure, and while she knew she couldn't blame them, she also couldn't help the pang of jealousy that hit her. I'm sorry I'm late. That's okay. It wasn't quite okay. Danielle hated to wait, and she especially hated it when she was this nervous. But then again, just one look at Michael's perfect features and kind smile was enough for her to forgive him completely. Up close, with only the surface of the table separating them, Danielle noticed just how impossibly green Michael's eyes were. Had they been that shade of emerald the first time too? And how had she not noticed before? You've been waiting long? Not long. Danielle lied, of course. Those had been the longest 15 minutes of her life, even though she still couldn't figure out why. Michael flashed her a smile that told her he had just seen right through her, but he appreciated her politeness. So, what's good here? He said, picking up the menu. You were telling me about some great burgers? They are, Danielle said readily. 5 minutes later, one of the waitresses came over to take their order. They both ordered burgers, although Danielle's was a veggie one. Michael arched a blonde eyebrow at that. You're a vegetarian? He asked, surprised. Yep, Danielle said. Is that a problem? Are you going to lecture me about protein? God, no, Michael chuckled. But you should know I'm an avid meat eater. I'm fine with that, as long as you're conscious of where your meat comes from. Oh, believe me, I'm very conscious. Michael handed his menu back to the waitress with a smile that clearly dazzled her. I'll have the cheeseburger, darling, please. How do you like your meat? Rare, medium? The rarest you can make it. Wow, Danielle said as Emily walked away. You really are an avid meat eater, Michael shrugged. Can't help it. But what about you? How come you've decided to go vegetarian? Factory farming is brutal, Danielle said sincerely. It started out as a protest against that, and then I just decided that my body will not be a tomb for other creatures, as Da Vinci said. Michael stared at her. He seemed struck by her words, as if he was reading something far deeper into them than Danielle could ever guess. She shifted in her seat, suddenly uncomfortable at the intensity in his eyes. Did I say something wrong? No, he said, visibly shaking it off whatever it was. It's just a very beautiful quote, that's all. Beautiful enough to convince you to start eating your veggies? Danielle teased. Michael gave her a smirk. Honey, nothing's beautiful enough for that. Not even me? Danielle blinked, taken aback by her own sudden, errant thought. Where had that come from? She cleared her throat inconspicuously, glad for the interruption when Emily came back with their drinks. These are on the house, Emily said as she placed the 2 pints down on the table. From Jack. Danielle looked over to the bar and gave her friend a grateful nod. Jack gave her a wink in response, but there was also something else, a shadow in his usually clear blue eyes. As he scanned Michael's figure, there was a sort of guarded look on his face that was very different from the open admiration with which he had looked at Michael the first night the man had entered the pub. Apparently Danielle wasn't the only one who noticed. Your friend is very protective of you, Michael said, and it wasn't a question. Danielle felt herself flush in embarrassment. I'm sorry, she offered, even though she wasn't quite sure what she was apologizing for. He's got a bit of a big brother streak to him. Well, that's not a bad thing. You could have worse people in your life than a big brother. Oh, that's for sure, Danielle agreed easily. She watched, mesmerized, as Michael gave her a kind, dazzling smile over the brim of his beer glass before he took a long sip. She thought there was something fitting about the man only drinking dark stouts. There was a kind of darkness to him. Danielle had not noticed it the first time they had met, but now that she had the man up close and personal, she could feel it radiating off of him. It was as subtle as an undercurrent, but it was definitely there, and it put her on edge. Perhaps going out with a complete stranger had been a mistake after all. Danielle took a steadying breath and told herself not to jump to conclusions. She could also see genuine kindness in Michael. Maybe his darkness was all inward and did not hurt others. Maybe his darkness was just a tough past. Everybody could have that. Maybe his darkness wasn't there at all, and she was simply giving too much free rein to her trust issues. And besides, even if he did turn out to be sketchy, nothing would happen to her. They were in a crowded pub, and Jack was watching them like a hawk. So she decided to stay on guard, but at the same time, shake off her uneasiness and enjoy the ride. And boy, what a ride it was. The more they talked, the more it seemed to her like Michael had seen everything. Every place on her to-visit list, he had been. He had traveled the world, quite literally. He had been everywhere. He had seen it all. The money, he told her, came from his family heritage. Where are they? She asked. Your family. His face had gone very dark then. Gone. Danielle blanched. I'm so sorry, she said quickly, feeling horrible about having hit such a raw spot so soon. I didn't mean. She had let the words hang in the air because really there weren't any words to say. Michael had shrugged it off like a trooper. It's all right. It was a long time ago. Danielle shivered. The man looked no older than 30. How young must he have been when he had lost his loved ones? She decided that she had done enough prying for one evening, and so she moved on to lighter topics. He wanted to know everything about her, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like he was only half listening in order to get in her pants later on. Michael really listened. He asked her questions. He asked her what made her want to become a nurse. He asked her about Ojai. He asked her why she wanted to leave so badly. And Danielle surprised herself by opening up to him in a way that she had not opened up to anyone in forever, with the sole exception of Jack. She spoke honestly and without masks, and little by little she felt her walls go down. And for the first time in a very long time, that did not scare her. There was something soothing about Michael's presence, about how genuinely interested he seemed to be in her, Danielle, the person, not the body. It was refreshing. "What about your family?" Michael asked her at some point. "Where are they from? You've got a mixed heritage, don't you?" He seemed sincerely fascinated by this. "My dad's from here," Danielle said, munching happily on her fries. "My mom was born in Japan. She moved to California with her family when she was very young." "Japan," Michael repeated, almost entranced. "Where from exactly?" "A small village outside of Kyoto." "Ah." It was the "ah" of someone who had been to that place, but there was no fond smile on Michael's lips. "You've been there too?" Danielle asked. "As a matter of fact, I have." Danielle frowned. A shadow flashed across Michael's features. Whatever his experience had been in Japan, it had clearly not been a good one. Danielle decided not to ask. She figured she had brought up enough bad memories. The rest of dinner was a quiet affair. Danielle found herself more and more enthralled by this man, who was so beautiful and had so much to say. She lost herself in his travel stories, and she offered domestic tales in return. It was the best exchange she'd had in a long while, and by the time he walked her to her car, she wanted nothing else but to kiss him. She didn't, however. She thought she had exposed herself enough for one night. "I'd like to see you again," Michael said. "If that's okay with you?" Danielle smiled. "I'd like to see you again, too. Can I call you?" "Of course." Danielle scribbled her number on the receipt for the dinner which they had split, just as she liked, and handed it to him. "Good night, then," Michael said, and he didn't kiss her either. Chapter 3. They saw each other again and again, and the more they saw of each other, the more Danielle realized that she was falling in deep. She couldn't get enough of Michael. He was funny and interesting and kind. He was confident and sexy, and he was driving her mad just by existing. 3 weeks had gone by since their first date, if that's what it could be called, and they'd had a few more since then. Sometimes they would go to the movies, sometimes they would walk around. Sometimes they would just sit and talk. It was always fun and it was always absorbing, and yet there was something that gnawed at Danielle's mind. No matter how good they seemed to feel around each other, Michael still had not made one attempt at kissing her. She couldn't help but wonder what that was about. There was sexual tension between them. She could feel it, and she was certain he felt it too. But no matter how charged up that tension was, he never made a move. His reserved attitude towards physical touch discouraged her in turn, and so she never made any attempts either. It was getting to be frustrating. She wondered where they were headed, provided that they were even headed anywhere at all. What was he looking for? He clearly wasn't looking to seduce her. Was he looking for a friend for however long he would remain in town? That was the other thing that put Danielle on edge. Michael had made it very clear that he was not in Ojai to stay. He didn't know when he would leave exactly, but it was certain that at some point he would go. Danielle didn't know how long she would have him for. She didn't know how much time she had to decide to finally throw caution to the wind and make that move neither of them seemed to be willing to take the risk to make. She felt like she was racing against time without having been given permission to race. "Are you seeing him again tonight?" Danielle jumped. She had been lost in thought and had not heard Jack approach her behind the bar. "He may stop by later," she conceded. She picked up a discarded cloth and began cleaning the counter, although it did not need cleaning. It was a very quiet evening, which was the worst kind of evening when you had something or someone to obsess over. It gave you way too much time to think. "How are things going with him?" Danielle hesitated. Jack wasn't giving her the malicious smirk he would give her any time they would talk about a new guy in either of their lives. Gone was the teasing and the pushing of the beginning. Now Jack sported a guarded expression on his face, and his hazel eyes were dark with suspicion. "You don't trust him, do you?" Danielle said, realization finally striking. Jack shrugged. "No, I don't. Why?" "I don't know," Jack admitted. "I can't quite put my finger on it. There's just something about him." Danielle wondered if that something was the darkness that she could still glimpse in Michael from time to time. She had long since come to the conclusion that anyone who had lost their entire family was allowed to have a bit of a dark side. He's all right, Jack, she offered, trying to reassure her friend. Really? How would you know? Jack retorted. How well do you know this guy? Not nearly as much as I'd like to, Danielle said readily. But I can tell he wouldn't hurt me. Jack shook his head. You be careful, sweetheart. I can see you may be getting in too deep, and trust me, that's never fun. Danielle refrained from rolling her eyes. She knew Jack was only trying to look out for her, and she knew he was speaking from experience. Very few people had been as unlucky as her best friend when it came to romantic encounters. I'll be careful, she promised. She looked up when the main doors swung open. It wasn't Michael, but she was still very glad for the distraction. As the young man walked up to the bar, Danielle idly wondered what was going on in her town, and where all these handsome people had been up until now. This man was tall and sported a lithe, slender figure. He had caramel skin and slightly almond-shaped dark eyes that seemed to be able to see into your soul. He had long black hair that he wore tied up into a bun. He was dressed casually, with blue jeans, a denim jacket opened in the front, and a V-necked burgundy t-shirt. Beside her, Jack whistled softly. Who is that? No clue, Danielle said. She grinned at the transfixed expression on her friend's face. He's all yours, though. Here, Jack mumbled. He smiled brightly once the stranger reached the counter. Hello there, he said. What can I get you? Danielle watched her friend's smooth approach, and as always, envied him for it. A glass of red wine, please, the stranger said. He had a clear, soothing kind of voice. It sounded like velvet. And a chat with you, if you would be so kind. Danielle blinked. The man had looked straight at her as he said the words. With me? She said, surprised. Jack snorted. Figures, he mumbled under his breath as he fetched the wine and the glass. The best ones are always straight. You're Danielle, aren't you? The stranger asked. He was staring intently at her, as if he were studying her. It made for a very uncomfortable scrutiny. I am, Danielle said after a moment, feeling at a loss. And who are you? I'm Stephen, Michael's brother. The young man flashed a white smile at her and held out his hand. Danielle shook it carefully. Michael had told her about his brother, and she had been curious to meet him. She did not expect him to seek her out, and she did not expect him not to look like Michael at all. One of them had probably been adopted, and Danielle resorted to never ask about it. It's very nice to meet you, she said, smiling back. Likewise. Stephen settled onto one of the stools at the bar. He nodded his thanks to Jack when he placed the glass of red wine in front of him. His gaze lingered over Jack's figure, even while the man walked off toward the kitchen. Your friend is quite beautiful, he said bluntly. Danielle blinked, taken aback. Yes, he is. You're gay? Stephen finished for her. Yes, for the most part. Danielle frowned. What does that mean? It means that I've been with a few women in my time, but I prefer men. Is he seeing anyone? Danielle felt a little thrown by this man's straightforwardness. Not that I know of. Perhaps I'll ask him to join me for a bite sometime. I think he'd like that, Danielle admitted, easily remembering the lust in Jack's eyes the minute he had spotted Michael's brother. So what are you doing here? I've come to see you. Why? We need to talk. About? You and my brother. I don't like it. Danielle blinked. She could tell this man was blunt, but she had not expected him to be this blunt. Excuse me? You heard me. Stephen took a sip of his wine, his dark eyes never leaving her. I don't think it's a good idea for you to continue seeing my brother. What does Michael have to say about it? Danielle retorted, and then she paled as she was struck with a horrible suspicion. Oh my God, she said, her eyes widening. Did he send you to dump me? What? No, Stephen said quickly. Of course not. In fact, he'd probably kill me if he knew I was here. Danielle sighed in relief. Then she straightened up to her full height. Then I don't understand, she said, meeting Stephen's penetrating gaze with her own stern one. You don't even know me. I don't need to know you, Stephen said. I know my brother, and that's more than enough. You'd be much better off if you stayed away from him. Why? I'm not going to hurt him. Maybe, Stephen conceded, but he's sure going to hurt you. Danielle felt a shiver run down her spine. That Michael's own brother would be coming to warn her off of him was definitely not a good sign. What are you talking about? She demanded. Stephen sighed heavily. Look, my brother, he's a good guy, really, but he's impulsive. He throws himself into things that may be bigger than him, and when he realizes it, he backpedals with no care for the consequences whatsoever. Are you saying Michael will disappear on me? He might, Stephen said. Actually, I hope he does, sooner rather than later. My brother is a loose cannon. He acts on a whim. He can't offer you anything that a woman might want. You don't know what I want, Danielle said. And if your brother is so impulsive, how come he hasn't even kissed me yet? Stephen groaned. I was afraid of this, he said quietly, almost to himself. He looked back up at her and swallowed visibly. I think he may be falling for you. Danielle's heart did a somersault in her chest. She did her best not to show her excitement to this man who was clearly so dead set against her being with Michael. And that's bad because he'll be safer if he doesn't have you in his life. Danielle stared at him. Stephen's words felt like a slap in her face. She couldn't understand what he was saying, and she sure couldn't understand why he was saying it. The one thing she knew was that she didn't appreciate a stranger coming to tell her who she could and could not see, even if that stranger was Michael's own brother. With all due respect, she began, her voice cold and hard, this isn't any of your business. Stephen smiled a bitter smile. Oh, but it is, you have no idea. Stephen! Stephen jumped. For the first time since he had walked in, the confident expression slipped away from his face to be replaced by a startled, almost guilty one. It was gone in a flash, but Danielle had caught it, and it gave her a sense of satisfaction. Michael strode up to the bar. What are you doing? He demanded. Stephen turned around to face him. I'm just having a chat with your lovely new conquest. Michael shot Danielle a quick look. It was clear that he noticed her distress immediately, because he then proceeded to glare at his brother with a thunderous expression on his face. What did you say to her? Only what you should have told her from the start. Danielle was impressed by the fact that Stephen wasn't even trying to cover up his actions. Michael looked over at her. What did he tell you? Danielle swallowed nervously. She wasn't sure she should touch this with a 10-foot pole. Coming between brothers was never a good idea. But the matter did concern her directly, after all. Look, I'm working, she finally snapped. I don't think we should be having this conversation right now. The brothers had the good grace to look embarrassed. Sorry, Danielle, Michael offered sincerely. We'll sort it out between us, Danielle snorted. Let me know how that goes. She watched Michael all but drag his younger brother out of the pub. He promised to come back later, but Danielle wasn't quite sure she wanted him to. Her head was still spinning with Stephen's words, and it continued to spin for the whole duration of her shift. What did Stephen mean when he said Michael would be safer without her in his life? What kind of danger could she possibly represent? Stephen, you had no right. You don't get it. I'm trying to look out for you. Who asked you? Michael was furious. He could not believe his brother. Stephen wasn't usually one to interfere so blatantly. Try as he might, Michael couldn't get the lost expression on Danielle's face out of his mind. Now he was pacing up and down the living room in their rented home, but the movement did nothing to ease his tension. What did you tell her exactly? He demanded. Did you tell her? No, Stephen cried, appalled at the suggestion. Do you really think I would expose us? Frankly, I don't know what to think right now, Stephen. What possessed you? Now she's going to start asking questions. Good for her, Stephen said, unfazed. And for you. Maybe that will finally convince you to stop seeing her. Michael let out a low growl. What did you tell her? He asked again. I told her I don't like you seeing each other. I told her to stay away from you. I told her you'll be safer if she's not around. You... Michael's protest died on his tongue as all of his brother's words registered. What are you talking about? Stephen looked defiantly at him. She dangerous, Michael. What? I didn't want her either. She turned my hunger off. So? So that's not a good thing, Stephen snapped. It felt wrong. It's not natural. Michael let out a laugh. Come on, Stephen, nothing about us is natural. Yes, well, this was even more not natural. Michael ran a hand over his face and exhaled slowly. You're being ridiculous. She's not a threat to us. How do you know? We have no idea why she's having this effect on us, and you're even more biased. Michael frowned. What are you talking about? You're falling for her. Michael snorted. Oh, please! It was true. He was falling for Danielle. He had realized it pretty much right away, but he wasn't about to admit it to Stephen. His brother was clearly freaked out enough. You are, Stephen said. It's obvious. How is it obvious? Because you're taking it maddeningly slow with her. She told me you haven't even kissed her yet. Stephen's eyes sparkled maliciously. She seemed rather disappointed about that, by the way. If vampires could blush, Michael would probably do just that right now. She told you that? He said, incredulous. Yes. And that's how I know you're falling for her. Stephen met his gaze straight on. It's a horrible idea, Michael, you know that. You have to step away now before things go too far. Michael stared at his brother. He could hear the worry and the fear written all over Stephen's features, and he wanted nothing more than to be able to wipe them away. But he couldn't do it. He had nothing to soothe his brother's terror with. I'm sorry, Stephen, he said quietly. I can't step away. Why not? Because I'm already in too deep. The realization came to him just then, and it was crystal clear. He had fallen fast and hard for Danielle, and he wouldn't be able to walk away from her now even if he wanted to, which he really, really didn't. Stephen looked at him horrified. Then we must leave. I'm not going anywhere, Michael said quickly. Oh, come on, Michael, Stephen snapped. What are you going to do? Start a relationship with this girl? Live a white picket fence and apple pie life? You can't do that. You don't have the tools. You can't offer her anything. You've seen vampire-human relationships before, and you know it always ends bloody. He took a step forward, his dark eyes all but impaling his older brother and keeping him rooted to the spot. Do you want it to end bloody, Michael? Michael cringed. This was too much of a raw wound for Stephen, and he knew there would be no constructive talk on the matter. I understand why you're afraid, he said, as carefully and gently as he could. But it might be different with her. And really, is her turning off our hunger such a bad thing? Stephen looked at him as if he thought he had gone mad. Yes, he said pointedly. Yes, it is. Michael sighed. Whatever. And besides, who said anything about a relationship? We're only here briefly, and I intend to get as much out of this time with Danielle as I possibly can. Stephen shook his head sadly. It's a slippery slope, brother. Maybe, but I'm willing to take the risk. It's not just about you, Stephen said. His shoulders were already slumped. He knew he was defeated. At least promise me you won't tell her about what we are. I promise, Michael said. He had no intention whatsoever of doing that. He wasn't afraid of Danielle, but he also wasn't that far gone that he didn't realize whatever made her turn off a vampire's instincts might not be good news. There was no telling what she might be able to do if she ever found out about what they were. Danielle didn't start this time. She heard him walk up to her as she was about to climb into her car in the Wooden Horse's parking lot. She turned around slowly, and sure enough, Michael was behind her, watching her. Just like before, she wasn't sure whether she was happy to see him. I didn't think I'd see you again tonight, she said. I needed to see you, but I knew you probably wouldn't be happy if I bothered you at work. He walked up to her. I'm sorry about my brother. Danielle nodded curtly. She knew Michael had nothing to do with what happened, but she couldn't help mistrusting him a little. She kept herself distant and guarded. He said you'll be safer if I'm not in your life, she said. What did he mean? Michael cringed visibly. I've been hurt in the past. He just doesn't want to see me get hurt again. He said you might hurt me. Michael winced, and Danielle felt a knot forming at record speed in her stomach. Was there some truth in Stephen's words, then? Was he right? Will you hurt me? No, Michael said immediately, and with such a fierceness in his voice that Danielle felt herself drawn to him all over again. I won't hurt you, Danielle, you have my word on that. Danielle watched him intently. He seemed sincere. She desperately wanted to believe him. So what do we do now, she asked. Is this goodbye? No. Michael seemed genuinely taken aback. Why would you think that? Danielle lifted an eyebrow. What else am I supposed to think? Michael smiled. He stepped closer, until he was close enough that he could reach out and place a hand on her hip. He lifted his other hand and cupped her cheek. The contact seemed to burn her from within. I don't care what my brother says, he said, his impossibly green eyes looking even greener in the light of the full moon. If you'll have me, I'm not going anywhere. Danielle swallowed past her suddenly dry mouth. Her heart was beating very fast within her chest. I'd like it if you stuck around for a while. Michael's smile broadened. Then it's done. His eyes flashed with a malicious glint then, and his smile turned into a smirk. Stephen tells me you've noticed I haven't kissed you. Oh, God. Danielle flushed scarlet, and she promised herself she would have a word with that nosy brother of Michael's. Well. She cleared her throat. She might as well put all cards on the table. I was beginning to think you may not be attracted to me. Michael blinked. Are you serious? Danielle shrugged, feeling foolish. I'm not really sure what else to think. You're new in town. Perhaps you're just looking for a friend. Michael's hands were still on her, and she knew now that she couldn't be more wrong. But he still had not kissed her. I'm not just looking for a friend, Danielle, Michael said. Friends are a great thing to have, but that's not what I'm looking for in you. Then what are you looking for? Michael didn't answer. His hand slid from her cheek to her nape, and he pulled her in. He kissed like a god. Passion frizzled and sparked underneath, but his kiss was slow and sensual. Danielle let herself go and kissed him back just as passionately. She had fantasized about this moment for quite some time. As it turned out, it exceeded all of her expectations. Chapter 4. They kissed for what felt like hours.
Oh no, this adult scene has been taken out and is exclusively available for Romancely Premium members. Check the description below to sign up. The love scene reference is Michael Chapter 4, Love Scene 1.
Danielle was still living in a world of bliss when she woke up the morning after. Oh, Christ, you had sex. And good morning to you too, Jack. Jack was staring at her over a mug of black coffee at a table in their favorite cafe. Danielle took her seat and didn't even bother to cover up the truth. If you must know, she said, distractedly picking up a menu. Yes, I did. So much for being careful. Danielle arched an eyebrow at him. You've had sex much sooner than this. Despite all of his reservations, Jack grinned. Indeed I have. Danielle rolled her eyes. They placed their orders, and she happily dug into her eggs and veggie bacon as soon as it arrived. She felt famished. Jack watched her in surprise. That must have been a good session. You're eating like you've burned off half your weight. Danielle laughed. I guess I did. So how is he? Give me details. I'm not going to give you details, Danielle protested. Then she grinned. But he's out of this world. Jack whistled softly. That good, huh? That good, Danielle confirmed. They had only lapsed into silence for a couple of minutes before Jack had to ask. So that brother of his. Oh no, Danielle said immediately. She put down her fork and stared at her friend as seriously as she could. You stay away from him. Jack had not heard her exchange with Stephen the night before, and she had been very careful not to mention anything about it to him. Still, she couldn't think of anything worse than her best friend hooking up with Michael's brother. Stephen may have warned her about Michael, but she didn't feel that comfortable around him either. Why? Jack asked. He's drop-dead gorgeous, and I think he may be into me. I caught him staring. Danielle cursed inwardly. Damn Jack and his being very conscious of who was watching whom. It doesn't matter, Jack, she said. She didn't bother to try and deny Stephen's attraction towards her friend. It would have been pointless, especially considering that Jack had already noticed it. "I've got a bad feeling about him." "You think he's the rotten apple of the family?" Jack's eyes sparkled. "You know I've got a thing for bad boys." Danielle groaned. It was unfortunately very true. "I know," she said, "but really, I think you should stay away." "Well, it's too late." Jack dug his phone out of his pocket and showed her a few texts. "I'm already meeting him tonight for a drink." "Really? I'm supposed to stay away from her and you're having drinks with her best friend?" Michael was staring incredulously at his brother, who was currently busy brewing himself a pot of coffee that he would drink simply because he liked the taste. He had woken up that evening to a text from Danielle, and while he had fantasized about romantic words, he had been surprised to find that she was writing to him about his brother's supposed date with her best friend instead. Michael had wasted no time confronting Stephen about it. Presently, Stephen shrugged. "It's just one drink, Michael. I'm not going to fall in love with the guy." He gave him a grin, but his eyes were dead. "Pinky swear." Michael cringed. He wished Stephen would not joke about that, even if it was his brother's burden to bear. "What kind of drink is it?" he asked. Stephen laughed. "Relax. I'm not going to feed on your girlfriend's best friend." "You'd better not," Michael said darkly. Stephen had not fed on people in decades. He wasn't sure he would be able to control himself if he decided to go back on a meat diet now. "I just want to talk to him for a bit," Stephen said. "He seems interesting, that's all." Michael eyed his friend carefully. "You want to drill him about Danielle?" Stephen brought a hand to his chest in a dramatic gesture. "Michael!" he cried, gasping theatrically. "How dare you suggest?" Michael rolled his eyes. "Whatever. I can't stop you from doing this, but please don't drag the guy into it any more than necessary. I want him out of harm's way. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Stephen said readily. His dark eyes then stared intently at Michael. "And what about Danielle? Is she out of harm's way?" Michael tensed up immediately. "Yes," he said through gritted teeth. "She's fine. She won't get hurt." "I hope to hell you're right, brother," Stephen said. "Because believe me, if you're wrong, the guilt of it will eat you alive." Michael sighed heavily. He watched as Stephen poured himself a cup of black coffee and took it with him out of the room. He shook his head and sat down heavily on one of the stools at the kitchen's island. The elation he still felt over his experience with Danielle the night before was rapidly evaporating. He couldn't shake the feeling that things were bound to get out of hand very soon. Chapter 5. Michael's house was a spacious but modest cottage on the outskirts of Ojai, on green hills so tranquil they could make anyone's tension dissipate in an instant. Danielle's tension, however, was not so easily deterred. There was something downright chilling about Jack going out with Stephen. Although she couldn't put her finger on it, something about Michael's brother terrified her. She had only met the guy once, but it was enough to know that he was bad news, and not only because he had demanded that she stay away from Michael. Danielle had sensed Michael's inner darkness, and she had sensed Stephen's too. Stephen's darkness was different. It was much darker, and it was much more there. You only had to look in the man's black eyes to know that something even blacker writhed somewhere deep within him. Danielle had not liked it, and she liked the idea of her best friend being alone with that darkness even less. Possibly picking up on her distress, Michael had suggested that she come for dinner at his place. Danielle had accepted gladly, in no small part also because she thought it would be a good, subtle way of waiting up for Stephen. She wondered if Michael shared her concerns. She wondered how to even bring up the subject. How do you tell the guy you're dating that you have the feeling his brother might be best kept very far away from you and everyone you care about? As she drove along the hills of the Ojai Valley, Danielle's tension did not dissipate. If anything, it increased. Her stomach was still in knots by the time she parked in front of the house, and it was still in knots when she finally rang the doorbell. It was a pity, really. It was a beautiful, warm night in the Ojai Hills, and if it wasn't for Danielle's anxiety, it could have been a near-perfect night. To her surprise, it wasn't Michael who came to open the door. It was a dark-skinned man whose relatively short height was made up for by striking cheekbones and a bright, dimpled smile. "Hello," he said, in a deep but not unkind voice. "You must be Danielle." He appeared to be pretty much her age, and the more Danielle looked at him, the more familiar he seemed. Yeah," she said, still taken aback by this stranger's presence in Michael's house. "Who are you?" "I'm Eli. I'm a friend of Michael and Stephen's." And then it clicked. "Eli?" Danielle repeated, eyes widening. "Eli Johnson?" He stared blankly at her. "Danielle Rowland. We went to high school together." Eli's face lit up with recognition. "Of course! I saw you around back then, but we were never properly introduced." It was true. They never had any classes together, but Danielle was good with names and faces, and she remembered him. He always struck her as a very kind person, and the warmth in his brown eyes as he recognized her now confirmed her impression from all that time ago. "It's nice to finally meet you then," Eli said. His handshake was as warm as his smile. Danielle relished Eli's kindness. It felt good to have some positive energy around her to ease the tension that was still eating away at her insides. "Please come in. Michael is waiting for you." "I haven't seen you around here in a while," Danielle said as she stepped inside and followed him down the hallway. The interior of the cottage was cozily decorated with bare or white wooden furniture. Warm touches were added by tapestries in the tones of deep reds and sunny oranges. It was a soothing atmosphere, but still Danielle couldn't shake the bad feeling that crawled under her skin. "I moved to LA for college, and of course I ended up staying," Eli said. "I drive out here from time to visit my parents, but I rarely stay longer than a weekend. This is my first long visit in a while." "So, you're friends with Michael?" "Yes. He and Stephen needed a vacation. Stephen suggested Ojai, so I offered them my family's cottage in the hills. We hardly ever use it anyway." "You're not staying here then?" "No, I'm staying at my parents'. I just come over to hang out." He was staring curiously at her, and Danielle realized then that the man was probably puzzled by all of her questions. "Sorry," she offered. "I didn't mean to grill you." Eli laughed. "Don't worry, you didn't grill me." Danielle offered him a weak smile in return. She didn't know what was up with the third degree she had just given a guy she had not seen in 10 years. In fact, she didn't know what was up with her in general. Even with her worrying about Jack, she should still be happy to spend a night alone with Michael. She should be able to enjoy herself and bask in the company of the man she was falling in love with. Instead, try as she might, she couldn't shake off a widespread feeling of uneasiness. Eli led her to the kitchen. It was a spacious room, with one section entirely dedicated to a dining area. A fairly large rectangular mahogany table was set for two, with candles burning within glass jars. The kitchen smelled like delicious food and considerate preparations. Danielle looked around. Michael was nowhere to be seen. "He'll be here soon," Eli said, guessing her thoughts. "He's probably in his room trying to figure out what to wear. He's been fretting over his wardrobe all day." Danielle wanted to go find Michael and tell him that he would look gorgeous no matter what he wore, and that as a matter of fact, she wouldn't have minded if he wore nothing at all. "I'll see myself out," Eli announced. Danielle looked over at him in surprise. "You're not going to wait for Michael?" "Nah, I'm not the one he's interested in seeing anyway." He winked. Danielle felt herself flush. "It was nice to see you again," she said. "You too, Danielle." Eli flashed her one last polite smile before he did exactly what he said he would, leaving her alone in the wonderful-smelling kitchen. Curious, Danielle walked over to the stove and gingerly lifted the lid off the large pot to peer inside. Her nostrils were immediately filled with the most delicious smell. Magically, her stomach unknotted itself and let out a grumble. Her mouth started to water. "It's seitan stew," Michael's voice said from behind her. "Eli made it for us." Danielle jumped and almost dropped the heavy lid. She whirled around. "You scared me." "Sorry," Michael offered with a grin that let her know he really wasn't sorry at all. "Sometimes I forget how lightly I tread." Danielle rolled her eyes. She carefully replaced the lid on the pot and walked up to him, smiling when she saw Michael was already moving to meet her halfway. Their lips met in a greeting kiss that spoke of a kind of intimacy and harmony that surpassed the few weeks they had known each other. "Come on, let's eat. How are you?" There was a casualty to Michael's voice and a lightness to his actions that for some reason made Danielle's heart beat just a little bit faster in her chest. She was still reeling from their lovemaking of the night before. She was still feeling his body against hers, his touch on her skin, his powerful cock inside of her. The memories alone were intoxicating. Apparently, the experience had an effect on Michael, too. He seemed lighter and more relaxed, more at ease around her. Could sex have been the key to unlocking his still somewhat guarded personality? "I'm good," Danielle said. "You?" "I'm so much more than good." He smiled the brightest smile she had ever seen blossoming on his lips. She took her seat at the table, sitting on the chair that he pulled back for her. She watched him, transfixed by this new side of him. "We also have appetizers," Michael announced. He went over to the kitchen area of the room and returned with a tray that he carefully set down on the table. Polenta croutons topped with mushrooms, melted cheese, and a spray of parsley. Danielle stared at him. For someone who claimed to only eat meat, he sure seemed to know his way around vegetarian dishes. "You made these? I'm impressed." Michael looked momentarily embarrassed. "Actually, Eli did." Danielle frowned. "Just as he made the stew?" she asked, his earlier words registering. "Yes." "And yet he's not staying for dinner?" "Why would he stay for dinner? This is a date." Michael appeared to be genuinely confused. "Because he made all the food," Danielle said, in a way that made it clear it should have been obvious. "Oh," Michael chuckled nervously. "He did it as a favor to me. I've long forgotten how to cook." Danielle stared at him in curiosity. "What does that mean?" To her surprise, Michael only shrugged. "Never mind, try one." She decided to let it go for the moment. She didn't want to risk disrupting Michael's newfound openness with questions that might send him running back behind that wall he always seemed to keep erect between them. Danielle reached out to pick up one of the croutons. As soon as she bit down on it, a wonderful combination of flavors exploded in her mouth. "These are fantastic!" she cried with her mouth full. She flushed and hastily lifted up her hand to cover her mouth. "Sorry," she muttered, swallowing. "I got excited." Michael laughed. "Do you always get this excited about food?" "As a matter of fact, yes, I do." He nodded. "I get it. Nourishment is a wonderful thing." That was also an odd thing to say, but Danielle resorted to let this one slide as well. The dinner went on pleasantly. Despite his professed love for red meat, Michael ate the vegetarian stew and seemed to enjoy it. As it turned out, Eli had also thought of dessert in the form of dark chocolate mousse spiced with a powder of chili peppers. "Isn't this supposed to be aphrodisiac?" Danielle asked with a grin when Michael set the small bowl in front of her on the coffee table. They had moved to the living room, where a fire burned in the fireplace despite the warm weather. Michael smirked back at her and took his seat next to her on the couch. Eli was never one for subtlety. The dessert was just as delicious as the rest of the dinner. It was creamy and puffy in just the right amounts, and the dark chocolate was to die for. "Eli should be a chef," Danielle commented as she all but scraped the bottom of the bowl with her spoon. A little voice in her head was telling her that she should probably eat with less voracity, but she silenced it quickly. If Michael couldn't take her love for good food, then they simply weren't meant to be. Michael, however, seemed absolutely unfazed by the unabashed appreciation Danielle was showing towards the dishes Eli had prepared for them. "He is," he said of his friend. "He works at a restaurant in downtown L.A. "You must give me the address." Michael laughed. "I will." They were quiet then. Somehow, for some reason, silence settled over them. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was intimate, and it enveloped them like a warm blanket. Although neither of them would have been able to say exactly how it had happened, who had moved first, they soon found themselves entangled together on the couch. Michael's arm was around Danielle's shoulders, and Danielle's head was nestled comfortably in the crook of Michael's neck. Danielle stared at the flames, watching as the fire licked at the air and burned away the oxygen. It was hypnotic, and it allowed for her thoughts and feelings to bubble to the surface. The fire seemed to invite her to be honest with herself and with the world around her. Silently, she came to terms with all that she felt. She accepted her worry for her best friend, and she accepted the fact that she had indeed fallen for Michael, a near stranger who was only going to be in town for a short while before he would walk out of her life as easily as he had entered it. "What are you thinking about?" Michael's voice was a rumble by her ear, as close as it was to his throat. Danielle didn't look away from the flames and shrugged. "Nothing, really," she lied. "Just letting my mind wander." Michael began to run his fingers through her hair. It was a very personal gesture, and it soothed her. "You're worried, aren't you?" Danielle craned her neck a little to look up at him. "About what?" "My brother being out with your friend." Danielle cringed inwardly. Was she that obvious? She reluctantly lifted her head off Michael's shoulder and sat up straighter to face him. "A little," she admitted. Michael arched a blonde eyebrow. "Only a little?" Danielle cringed again. "Busted! Am I that transparent?" Michael smiled a knowing smile. "Actually, you've been very discreet. But I know you don't trust my brother, and I don't blame you," he added quickly when Danielle opened her mouth to protest. "Who would trust him after the speech he gave you?" Danielle hesitated for a moment, and then she decided that, seeing as they were already on the subject, and that he was the one to bring it up, she might as well tell the whole story. "It's not about that," she said. Michael frowned. He watched her suspiciously. "What do you mean?" Danielle licked her lips nervously. She sighed. She couldn't do it. How do you tell the man you love that you think his brother might be no good? "Never mind." "No, tell me," Michael said. "Please." There was no animosity in his request, no defensiveness in his voice. He really wanted to know. Danielle hesitated again. "You're not going to like it." "It's okay. I didn't think I would." Again, there was no hostility in Michael, no aggressive protectiveness of his brother. He genuinely wanted to hear what Danielle had to say, even if he knew it would be nothing good. Danielle took a deep breath. "There's something off about your brother," she finally blurted out. Michael blinked. "Off?" he repeated. "What do you mean, off?" Danielle pushed her dark hair away from her face in frustration. How was she ever going to put this without sounding completely crazy? "I don't know," she began carefully. "I can't explain it. It's a feeling, really. Like he may be." She trailed off, unable to say it. "He may be what?" Michael prompted. "Say it, Danielle." His green eyes had hardened now. Danielle forced herself to finish what they had started. "Dangerous," she said. "I've got a feeling like he may be dangerous." Michael stared at her. She waited for him to go off on her. She waited for him to tell her that she was insane, and how dare she even think that of his brother. She waited for him to deny it. But Michael didn't. He didn't get mad, and he didn't deny it. Instead, he heaved a deep sigh that had Danielle's heart galloping within her chest and slamming against her ribcage. "What?" she said, finding that her voice was choked and barely there. "What is it?" "Stephen, Michael hesitated. He made mistakes in the past. Danielle was afraid to ask, but she asked anyway. "What kind of mistakes?" "The kind of mistakes that get people hurt." "It wasn't his fault," Michael hurried to explain. "It was an accident, but he's been carrying that burden with him for years now. He's convinced himself that he's a bad person. He's not." Danielle watched him warily. "He isn't?" "No," Michael said fiercely. "He isn't. He's just a little lost and a lot angry." "So he's not going to hurt Jack? Why would he hurt your friend?" Michael seemed genuinely confused. Suddenly, Danielle felt like an idiot. She shook her head at herself. "I don't know, Your brother makes me uneasy," she admitted. Michael smiled a little. "He can have that effect on some people. Hell, I can have that effect on some people." "You don't make me uneasy." Michael stared at her. He seemed almost surprised by her admission. "I don't?" No. Danielle smiled gently at him. Why would I stick around if you did? The good food? Michael joked. Danielle shook her head with a smile. Seriously, Michael, you make me feel. She trailed off, hesitating. Should she say it? Dare she say it? What, Danielle? Michael prompted. I make you feel what? Like myself. There, she'd said it. Michael was very close. Close enough that Danielle could lose herself in his green eyes. You make me feel like I'm home. I think I've fallen for you. I think I love you. There, she'd said it all. Michael looked at her with an unreadable expression on his face. He was silent for a very long time. So long, in fact, that Danielle eventually convinced himself that she had gone too far. I'm sorry, she said, breaking the horrible, soul-crushing silence. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. Why not? Michael finally spoke. His features were still unreadable, but they were beginning to soften. Didn't you mean it? Yes, Danielle said. Of course I meant it. Then I'm glad you said it. The silence was back. Danielle's mind was racing. She wasn't necessarily expecting Michael to say it back, but she would have expected him to say something. Anything, really. She would have expected for her offering of her heart on her open palm to at least be acknowledged. Instead, it didn't look like Michael was even going to touch the subject. Michael was staring pensively into the flames, and the fire that earlier on had given her the impression of setting an atmosphere now felt way too warm to Danielle in this already tepid summer night. You know, you don't look all that glad, she finally ventured, sneaking a sideways glance at Michael. Michael looked over at her. No, I am, he said. I am glad. Danielle arched an eyebrow. Forgive me if I'm not convinced. I mean, it's not like I was expecting you to say it back or anything, it's just, well, you could at least say something. The last thing she wanted to do was to put any pressure on him, but she really couldn't stand the silence. Michael sat up straighter. He turned his body so that he was fully facing her. His green eyes had gone very dark and very intense, and suddenly, Danielle wasn't sure she wanted to hear whatever it was that he had to say. I love you too. I've fallen for you too. Danielle stared at him, speechless. Of all the things she would have expected him to say, this definitely wasn't it. Really? She asked, unable to keep the note of insecurity from her voice. You're not just saying? Michael gave her a kind smile. I'm not just saying. I just wasn't sure if I should tell you, even now. Danielle frowned. Why not? Michael briefly looked away. Because Stephen is right, Danielle. I've made mistakes in the past. I've hurt people. I don't really care about your past, Danielle said, and as she said it, she was surprised to find that it was true. I care about your present. Would you hurt me? No, Michael said forcefully. Never. Danielle smiled. There you go, then. Michael stared at her incredulously. There you go, then? That's it? I love you, Danielle said, surprised at how easy that was to say now that she had said it for the first time. You love me. As far as I'm concerned, there isn't anything else to say that would matter. The silence that fell over them then was a stunned one as Michael tried to take Danielle's words in. You should kiss me now, she said. Michael did. Danielle savored the by-now familiar feeling of Michael's full, soft lips on her own. She savored the ever-sensual energy of Michael's kisses. But there was something else there this time, a sense of newfound tenderness that radiated off Michael in waves. When Michael wrapped his arms around her and pulled her closer, there was a sense of sheltering to the gesture that had not been there before. It was as if Michael was trying to shelter her from the world. Danielle pulled away and back just enough to look at him curiously. Are you all right? Michael looked down. I tried very hard not to fall for you, he admitted quietly. He almost seemed to be embarrassed by his own feelings. Why, Michael? Danielle asked. Why have you tried not to fall for me? Michael shrugged. He didn't say anything. Michael, look at me. Michael did, and Danielle's heart clenched. For the first time since she had met him, his confidence disappeared. He looked lost. He swallowed visibly and licked his lips. I'm terrified Stephen may be right. Well, he's not, Danielle said forcefully, surprising even herself with the vehemence in her voice. How do you know? There was a hint of hopelessness in Michael's green eyes that tore at Danielle's heart, and she vowed to disperse it. I know you make me happy, she said, and now that I also know you love me too, I'm not letting you run from this. Michael smiled. You're very stubborn. I am, Danielle admitted easily. She grinned. Isn't that why you fell for me? Michael gave her a smirk in return. One of the many reasons. As he pulled her back in for another kiss, Danielle's heart raced.
Oh no, this adult scene has been taken out and is exclusively available for Romancely Premium members. Check the description below to sign up. The love scene reference is Michael, Chapter 5, Love Scene 2.
There was a sudden bang, followed by the sound of the front door being opened violently enough to send it rocketing off its hinges. Michael! It was Eli's voice. Danielle and Michael both jumped up, but they didn't have the chance to rush over and see what the commotion was about. The commotion came to them. Stephen stumbled into the living room, Eli hovering helplessly behind him. It was clear that the black man would have wanted to do something, but he didn't dare touch Stephen. And really, Danielle thought, who could blame him? Michael's brother was a scary sight to behold. His copper skin was clammy with sweat. His pupils were blown wide. His black hair had escaped the hold of the stylish bun and now cascaded down his shoulders like a dark mane, adding to the wildness of his look. But what really disconcerted Danielle was the blood on his t-shirt and around his mouth crimson black blood. There was a devastated look on Stephen's face. Tears streamed down his cheeks. Danielle could feel the panic and terror radiating off him in two powerful, unbearable waves. Oh my God! Michael all but choked out beside her. He reached out an arm and pushed her back, out of harm's way. Stephen? He tentatively stepped forward towards his dismayed brother. Stephen halted. He watched Michael walking up to him warily, like a cornered animal may watch an approaching would-be capturer. Stephen, Michael said again. He was trying to reach him, to reach the person that was still buried somewhere in there, underneath the pain and dread. But Danielle wasn't sure Stephen was hearing him. She wasn't sure Stephen was hearing anyone or anything. Michael's eyes never left his brother as he approached him slowly. Eli, get her out of here, he said, still never looking away. Eli was quick to walk over to Danielle in order to take her to safety, but he wasn't quick enough. Michael's words seemed to have reminded Stephen of Danielle's presence, and he moved faster than any of them thought possible. Before anyone could react, he was in front of her. When Eli tried to stop him, he sent him flying across the room with what appeared to her to be only a flick of his hand, and next thing Danielle knew, he was slamming her against the nearest wall. He held her there. Up close, she could really see the wildness, the madness in Stephen's dark eyes. It terrified her. You've got to stop me, he said. Make it stop. His voice was hoarse. It sounded like sandpaper. There was a raw, desperate plea in every syllable he uttered, but Danielle barely heard it. The craziness in Stephen's black irises wasn't the only thing that she could see now that he was so close to her. There were fangs in his mouth, wolf-like fangs, that stood out horribly among his human teeth. They were sharp and horrifying, and they glistened red with blood. It took Danielle's brain a moment to come to terms with the fact that that was really what she was seeing. When it finally did, her eyes widened. She wanted to push him away from her, but she was too petrified to move. What are you? She asked, choking on the words. You know what I am, Stephen hissed in her face. I don't... Stephen slammed her against the wall again, the impact making her bones rattle. Make it stop! Stephen! Suddenly Stephen was off her. Michael pinned his brother to his own chest and kept him in a firm lock. Stephen writhed and kicked and screamed, but Michael didn't budge. She can turn it off! Stephen's wild eyes searched for her again. Turn it off! Turn off my hunger! What are you? Danielle screamed back. And then she froze. Whose blood is that? She asked in a voice she could barely hear. But Stephen heard her, and it seemed to only crush him more. He went limp in his brother's arms. Michael followed his movements until they were both kneeling on the floor. He maneuvered them both so that they were facing each other. Keeping Stephen still with one arm, he cupped his brother's cheek firmly with his free hand. "Stephen," he called, firmly but not unkindly, "what have you done?" "I'm sorry," Stephen cried. "I'm so sorry. I tried to stop. He's too beautiful. I tried to stop." "Stephen!" Michael shook him forcefully. "What did you do? Whom did you feed on?" "It's Jack's, isn't it?" Danielle whispered. Her stomach was in knots. She felt like she might throw up on the spot. "It's Jack's blood." Chapter 6. As it turned out, it was Jack's blood, and what Stephen was a vampire. So was Michael. Danielle sat by Jack's bedside and tried to make sense of it all. So far, she was unsuccessful. No matter how hard she tried, she just couldn't wrap her mind around it. She couldn't comprehend what she had seen. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the wild, crazed look in Stephen's black irises. It made the blood in her veins run ice cold. Her blood. She still couldn't come to terms with the idea that Michael had been craving her blood for all the time they had been dating. She still couldn't accept that the blood on Stephen's dark green t-shirt had been Jack's, and that Stephen's fangs had glistened with it. Hell, she still couldn't even accept that Stephen had fangs to begin with. It was simply too absurd. And yet it was true. There was no denying it. Jack's pale figure in the hospital bed was all the proof she needed, as well as the puncture marks on the left side of his neck, which the doctors had been quite baffled about. The steady beeping of the heartbeat monitor did very little to soothe her thoughts and calm the tension in her whole body. Every time she looked over at her friend, she began to shake all over. The minute she had learned that the blood was Jack's, Danielle had rushed out of the house, leaving Michael and Eli to deal with a very distressed Stephen. Now, hours later, Danielle didn't wonder what they were doing. She didn't wonder how Stephen was, if Michael had managed to get through to him. She didn't wonder if Eli had gotten any bruises from having been thrown across the room when he tried to step in between her and Stephen. She didn't wonder how Michael was feeling. She didn't care. The only thing Danielle cared about at the moment was making sure that Jack would be all right. She couldn't think about anything else, wouldn't think about anything else. She didn't end up going to good places when she did. How stupid she had been to offer Michael her heart like she had. How perfectly naive. Michael may have said, "I love you," back, against all odds, but Danielle knew now that he had not meant it. She knew what the darkness she had first sensed in Michael was now, and she knew it wasn't a kind of darkness that allowed for love. Danielle shook her head to push those thoughts away. She had been going in circles all night and she was exhausted and terrified. She ran her hands over her face and blew out a breath. She stood, stretching her aching back and working out the kinks in her neck. She checked on Jack and, satisfied that her friend was deeply asleep, she left the room and headed for the cafeteria. Her head was spinning and she didn't know whether it was from lack of sleep or from everything that had happened. She got a fruit salad and a large coffee and settled at a table in the farthest corner of the room. She didn't want to talk to anyone or risk any form of human contact whatsoever. She put extra milk and sugar in her coffee because Michael only drank black coffee. It was very childish, but it still gave her a small pang of satisfaction. She was halfway through her 4 a.m. snack when the last person she wanted to see walked into the large room. Michael paused just past the door and looked around. When he spotted her, he made his way over to her. Danielle clenched her fist under the table. She made to stand, but Michael had already gotten to her and held out a hand to stop her. "Danielle, please, don't leave." Danielle glared at him. "What do you want? Why are you here? If it's to finish what your brother had started, I swear to God." "What?" Michael looked pained at the accusation. "Of course not. I just want to talk, truly." He held up both hands to show that he meant no threat. "Please, Danielle," he said again. Danielle didn't care about the sorrow in Michael's green eyes, but she sat back down anyway, wary and reluctant. Michael sat across from her. He placed both hands on the table, fingers intertwined. His thumb tapped nervously on the back of his hand. "How's Jack?" he finally ventured to ask. "He's stable," Danielle said coolly. Michael nodded. He looked immensely relieved. That's good. No, Michael, that's not good. Danielle all but growled at him. Your brother almost bled him dry. There was a sentence she never thought she would get to say. Michael winced. I'm sorry. Sorry is not good enough. And it really, really wasn't. I know. I'll keep Stephen away from him from now on. Danielle snorted. That's the least you can do. Silence fell over them with the heaviness of a cartoon anvil. There was so much to say, and yet neither of them seemed to know where to start. Finally, Michael spoke. I meant what I said last night. I have fallen for you. I do love you. Danielle looked up at him. Michael's green eyes were as warm and sincere as they had been the night before when he had said the words, but Danielle couldn't bring herself to believe him. Michael had just proven that he knew her more than Danielle would like to admit. It was as if he had read her fears, her thoughts. Danielle stopped her train of thought dead in its tracks. She looked at Michael suspiciously. Can you read people's minds? Michael blinked. What? People's thoughts. Can you read them? No. Danielle studied him carefully. He seemed to be telling the truth. She looked over at their reflection in the cafeteria's glass wall and was horrified to find that there was actually only one reflection there, her own. Mirrors, she said quietly, almost to herself. Of course, vampires did not reflect in mirrors. How had she not noticed Michael's lack of a reflection before? Then again, she guessed he had been very careful about not finding himself in front of any reflecting surface when he was with her. Michael followed her gaze and smiled a little. Yep. Aren't you afraid people will notice? Danielle asked, looking around. The other patrons seemed oblivious. You'll be surprised what people don't notice when they're not looking for something odd, Michael said. Besides, this is a hospital. The people who are here are generally too preoccupied to notice anything around them. Danielle continued to stare at him. You seem to know a lot about hospitals. Realization finally hit. Do you get your blood from hospital bags? Michael shifted in his seat, suddenly uncomfortable. Stephen does, usually. Danielle arched an eyebrow. Stephen does? She repeated. Are you fucking kidding me? Michael had the good grace to cringe visibly. Usually, he said again. He had not had human blood directly from the source in decades. I don't know what got into him last night. Where is he now? At the cottage, resting. Don't worry, he's very subdued, Michael assured. I promise. Danielle wasn't quite convinced. Will he go back to drinking blood from hospital bags? He will, Michael said. He has to. He can't control himself. Danielle shuddered at what might have been. She was beginning to realize that all in all, Jack had been lucky. What about you? She asked, even though she was terrified to ask. Do you get your blood directly from the source? Michael hesitated. Yes. Danielle's eyes widened. Horror came to wash over her all over again. You kill people? She whispered, aghast. No, Michael said quickly, vehemently. It's not like that, Danielle, I swear. I stop before I can do any damage. Danielle watched him warily. Deep down, she believed him, but she was still too on edge to allow herself the luxury of showing it. How come none of your victims ever come after you? I wiped their memory. You what? Michael swallowed visibly. I compel them to not remember what I did. He hesitated, like I will do to Jack. Danielle froze. Excuse me? I will wipe away the memory of what happened last night. He won't remember a thing. No, you won't, Danielle said forcefully. Michael frowned. Why not? It's what's best for him. No, Danielle corrected. It's what's best for you. I want Jack to remember exactly who your brother is. Danielle, I can't. Jack won't say a thing to anybody. Danielle cut him off sharply. But I need him to remember so that he can stay away from your brother. How do you know he won't talk? Danielle snorted. Come on, Michael. Even if he did, who would believe him? They'd think he's a madman. Michael seemed to think it over for a while. Finally, he nodded. All right, he eventually agreed. If that's what you really want, I won't wipe his memory. That's what I really want. Danielle finished her coffee and threw the paper mug in a nearby trash can with a perfect toss. I have to get back to Jack now. I don't want him to wake up alone. She made to stand, but Michael reached out to grab her wrist. His green eyes were pleading. What will you do? He asked fervently. I won't expose you, if that's what you're afraid of. No one would believe me either. That's not what I meant. Michael hesitated. I meant about us. What will you do about us? Danielle smiled bitterly. Her heart was breaking in her chest. There's no us, Michael. A stricken expression came on to Michael's features as he was hit with a realization. He pulled away slowly. You're afraid of me, he said, and to Danielle's surprise, his voice broke. Danielle swallowed hard. I would be an idiot not to be, she said. I would never hurt you. How do I know? Maybe you already did, and I don't remember it. Pain flooded Michael's beautiful face. No, he said quietly. I never hurt you, and I never will. Besides, even if I wanted to, I can't. Why not? I don't know. You turn off our hunger. Danielle blinked. What? Michael took a deep breath. The reason I was so drawn to you is that you're the first human whose blood I don't have a thirst for. Stephen felt it too. You turn our hunger off. We have no desire to feed on you. Make it stop! Turn it off! Turn off my hunger! All the things that Stephen had yelled at her earlier that night suddenly made sense. Except that they didn't. Why? Danielle asked, her head spinning. Why do I turn off your hunger? I don't know, Michael admitted. We can't explain it. You just do. Danielle shook her head. She wasn't going to listen to one more word. I can't do this, she said. She stood, and Michael stood with her. Please, don't follow me, Danielle said. If you really love me, like you say, then please get out of my life. Danielle. You drink human blood, Michael, Danielle finally snapped. Your brother almost killed my best friend. She shook her head. I can't be with you. I won't be with you. Goodbye. She turned her back on him and hurried out of the cafeteria and down the hall, her heart racing. She knew she was doing the right thing. She knew it, and yet her heart broke and tears streamed down her face. Michael's heart was broken. It broke for himself, because no matter how much he tried to tell himself that he should just forget about it, he had the feeling he had just lost the best thing that could happen to him in his very long life. It was downright impossible to forget Danielle. She was unforgettable. She had made him feel alive in a way that he had not felt in close to 300 years, no matter how much he convinced himself that he didn't mind being a vampire. Michael's heart broke for Stephen, for the devastation that what he had done had brought trouble to his brother. It had been a long time before he could get Stephen calm and, most importantly, balanced enough that he trusted him to be left alone with Eli. Then again, if anyone besides him could reach his brother, it was Eli. Those two had formed a special bond. If drinking human blood didn't send Stephen spiraling, Michael was pretty sure that Eli would even let him feed on him. After all, he let Michael feed when things got rough. Michael made his way back to the cottage by running through the fields and the hills, away from human eyes. He needed to blow off some steam, but when he finally reached the front door of their temporary accommodation, he found that the run had not helped at all. His heart was still broken, and he was still furious. He was furious at himself for not having seen this coming and letting himself believe that he could actually make things work with Danielle. He was furious at the events for happening. He was furious at his brother for giving in. What was it about Jack, anyway? Stephen had not had one drop from an actual pumping vein for 3 decades. What was it about Jack that he had found so irresistible? The sky told him he still had 1 hour before dawn, and he was determined to use that time to talk to his brother and get to the bottom of this. He took a deep, calming breath before going in. He found Eli sitting at the kitchen table nursing a cup of coffee. Where is he? Michael asked. Living room, Eli said. He's calm enough. Michael nodded and made to walk away. He stopped as an afterthought. Are you okay? Eli flashed him the tired smile of someone who had one hell of a night. I'm fine, Michael nodded again. Thank you, he said sincerely. How's Danielle's friend? He'll be all right. Eli sighed in relief. Thank God. I don't think he could have taken it if, you know. Michael's face darkened. Yes, he said quietly. I know. Go get some rest, Eli. You look horrible. Eli chuckled darkly. Geez, thanks. Michael gave him the ghost of a smirk and then walked away, making a beeline for the living room. He found Stephen laying on his side on the couch, staring blankly at the fireplace where only ashes and charred wood remained, the flames having extinguished themselves a long time ago. He looked up when Michael entered, and Michael tried not to wince at the bone-shattering sorrow written all over his brother's features. He knew he had to be as firm and hard as he could without sending Stephen running. He couldn't afford to be mollified. Sensing what was coming, Stephen dragged himself up in a sitting position, wordlessly making room for Michael, who sat down beside him. Michael remained silent for a while, battling his emotions in order to keep them in check and not let them get the best of him. This was a delicate matter, and his own anger and hurt could not dictate the words he would say. How are you feeling? He finally asked. Stephen didn't look at him as he responded. Better. Are you still thirsty? The "from blood from the vein" went unasked. It was more than clearly implied. Stephen shuddered. God, no. Jack is going to be all right, Michael offered. Stephen looked like he was going to pass out from relief. Really? He said, turning his head to look hopefully at him. Really, Michael said. Have you wiped his memory yet? No, Danielle won't let me. Stephen frowned. What do you mean she won't let you? She wants Jack to remember, so that he'll stay away from me, Stephen guessed. Michael nodded. You can hardly blame her. Stephen bit down tensely on his lip. What if Jack exposes us? He won't, Michael said. Danielle says even if he did, no one would believe him. She has a point. What about her? Will she talk? No. Michael was sure of it. No matter how angry or disgusted she may be, Danielle would not expose them, if only in order to avoid putting Jack and herself in any more danger. What happened, Stephen? He asked then. He was sure he would hate the answer, but he had to know. Stephen looked away again, curling in on himself. His shame was obvious. I don't know. Bullshit, Michael said, hard enough for his brother's head to snap up and for his brother's eyes to find his again. You do know. Now tell me. What happened? Stephen swallowed visibly. He licked his lips. I fell. Michael's eyes widened. You fell for the guy? You barely know him. No, Stephen said. I didn't fall for the guy. I meant I fell into temptation. Why? You've been tempted plenty of times before and you never strayed. What was different? I don't know, Stephen admitted, his voice soft and quiet. I really don't, he reiterated when Michael looked at him skeptically. Jack is very beautiful and very pure. Michael frowned. He didn't get it. You've been with beautiful men before. Yes, but not with pure ones. Shit. Michael did get it then. Jack was beautiful and had a pure heart, just like Peter. He sighed. Stephen, he said, as gently as he could. He's not Peter. Stephen winced. I know, but he's just like him. They even have the same eyes. It was like being with a ghost. The more I talked to him, the more he reminded me of him. I kept telling myself I should go, but I couldn't. His dark eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry, he choked out, shoulders shaking. I'm so sorry, I didn't mean it. I didn't want it. I don't know what happened. I do, Michael said quietly. He reached out to wrap one arm around his brother's shoulders and pulled him to his chest. Stephen went willingly, burying his face against Michael's shoulder. Peter was the only one you ever loved. Walking away from someone who reminded you of him so strongly, it's almost impossible. You would've, Stephen said, his voice muffled by Michael's shirt. You're a lot stronger than me, than anyone we know. I keep saying you're weak because you drink blood from the source, but you're not. You're the strong one. Michael sighed. Somehow he wasn't so sure. He held his brother a little tighter. I almost killed him, Stephen whispered. I couldn't stop. It was like with Peter. His voice broke then, and he was unable to go on. "It wasn't like with Peter," Michael said firmly. He still shuddered to think back on what had happened back then. Peter had convinced Stephen to drink from him. He seemed to think they would be even closer then, and truth be told, he was not wrong. Peter was convinced that Stephen would stop in time, and so was Stephen. But it had not been the case. It was Stephen's first taste of human blood directly from the source in over a century, and he had not been able to stop, no matter how much he loved Peter. If anything, the fact that he loved him as he did made him want his blood all the more. Stephen had never been able to forgive himself, and Peter's death had almost killed him. And now history had almost repeated itself, but Michael thought almost was a key word here. "You stopped. Look at me." Michael pushed Stephen away enough to catch his gaze and hold it firmly. "You stopped, Stephen. Jack is alive and he's going to be just fine. You stopped. It wasn't like with Peter." He waited for his words to sink in. Finally, Stephen nodded shakily. They spent the rest of the time separating them from the dawn, sitting on the couch, Michael's arm wrapped firmly around his brother's shoulders and Stephen's head resting on his shoulder. They didn't talk. There was no need to. Michael let his mind wander. Inevitably, his thoughts drifted over to Danielle. He wanted nothing more than to be with her, but he knew that was off the table now. Danielle was disgusted by him. She was afraid of him. "You drink human blood, Michael." And then a thought struck him. What if he didn't? What if he gave it up for Danielle? Would things be different then? Could she consider the possibility of coming back to him? The more Michael thought about it, the more it struck him as a good idea. In fact, it was the only idea he had. It was the only way. As long as he fed on humans, he would always be a monster to Danielle. That he didn't kill them was irrelevant. But he had seen the way Danielle had looked at him before, and he knew there had been a time when he had been more than a monster to her. He was determined to make sure that she saw him in that light again. Chapter 7. More than 1 month had passed, 5 weeks and 2 days to be exact, but who was counting? And things had gone more or less back to normal. Jack was as good as new physically speaking. Emotionally, he was still shaken up. He and Danielle had spent days after he had been released from hospital going over what had happened and the appalling fact that vampires existed and had entered their lives. Thankfully, they also seemed to have walked out of their lives. Danielle knew they were still staying at the cottage in the hills, but to their credit, neither Stephen nor Michael had shown up again after that one horrible, fateful night. But was it really something to be thankful for? Try as she might, Danielle couldn't bring herself to be grateful for Michael's absence. She tried not to, but she missed him. She missed him terribly, in the same way that lungs miss air. Presently, she tried to throw herself into her work and not think about anything at all. But as always, whenever she tried to run away from her thoughts, fate intervened and dealt her an extremely quiet night at the Wooden Horse. "Too few patrons tonight," Jack grumbled from beside her. "Too much time to think." Danielle flashed him a smile. "You've read my mind." Jack cocked his head to one side and watched her carefully. "You miss him, don't you?" Danielle cringed inwardly. They never touched the subject of Michael, but it seemed like Jack was intent on breaking the silence tonight. "I wish I could say I don't." Jack nodded. "I get it, you loved him." Danielle snorted. "The crazy part is that I still do." "Honey, the crazy part is that he's a vampire." Danielle had to laugh despite everything. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I guess that's the crazy part. Mark my words, from now on, I am going to thoroughly scan every handsome stranger who asks me out," Jack said. He unconsciously lifted one hand to bush his fingers over the scars on his neck. They were barely visible, but they were also undeniably there. "I'm sorry," Danielle said. "If only I had listened to you when you said something was off with Michael, none of this would have happened." She had apologized more times than she could count, and more times than Jack himself seemed to deem necessary, but she couldn't stop. The guilt was too strong. As he always did whenever Danielle said the S words, Jack shook his head. "You have nothing to apologize for. How could you have known?" Danielle shrugged. She couldn't, of course, but that did nothing to diminish her guilt. She was now obsessed with making sure nothing like that would ever happen again. She had spent the past 5 weeks gathering information on vampires, just in case, and eventually she had stumbled upon knowledge that was right under her nose, in her own family. She hesitated now, wondering if she should share that information with her friend, and finally she decided that she didn't want to bear the burden by herself. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly, eyes darting around to make sure no one was eavesdropping. Jack frowned and leaned closer to her behind the counter. "I'm intrigued." Danielle swallowed hard. "Remember how Michael told me I apparently turn off their hunger?" "Yes. Lucky you," Jack said with a small grin. Danielle ignored the comment. "You know how my grandma is obsessed with myths and legends?" "Yeah," Jack groaned. "Oh God, what's the connection here?" Danielle cringed. "I went to her place yesterday and asked her about vampires." She blanched. Before I knew it, I was telling her what happened. Jack's hazel eyes widened. "Danny," he hissed, horrified. "Are you insane? If they find out, they won't find out," Danielle said quickly. "Now listen. As it turns out, the women in the Japanese part of my family have known about vampires all along, at least up until my grandmother. Apparently, my mother was too little when they came to the States to be informed." Jack frowned worriedly. "Informed of what?" Danielle took a deep breath. "It seems their village back in Japan was plagued by a few vampires who lived in the area. My great-grandmother cast a spell that would repel them from the female members of our family." "What about the males?" Danielle shrugged. "Apparently blood spells only work on the female members of the family when the witch casting the spell is a woman." Wait. Your great-grandmother was a witch? Are you joking?" "I wish I were," Danielle admitted. "I didn't want to believe it at first, but you've got to admit, we don't have any other explanation as to why my blood is not appealing to them." Jack stared at her. Eventually, he sighed. "I guess not," he conceded. "Is your grandmother a witch too?" He hesitated. "Are you?" Danielle arched an eyebrow. "Yeah, I'm a witch," she said sarcastically. "I'm not. And neither is my grandmother. She didn't want to learn the craft, she says." "What will she do about our vampires?" "Nothing," Danielle said. "She'll stay away from them, just like we're doing." Jack nodded. "Good." Danielle was about to change the subject to a lighter topic when the doors of the pub opened and Eli Johnson walked in. She cursed under her breath. "What?" Jack asked, following her gaze. "Who's that?" "A friend of Michael's." Jack grimaced. "What's he doing here?" "Beats me." Eli walked up to the counter and settled on one of the stools. He cleared his throat in embarrassment. Hi," he said. Danielle stared coldly at him. "Hi. What are you drinking?" "Nothing. I came to talk to you." "I've got nothing to say." "But I do." Eli looked over at Jack. "Are you Jack?" Jack hesitated. "I've got the feeling I'm about to wish I wasn't." Eli gave him a small smile. "Nah, I wanted to say I'm glad you're okay." Jack nodded curtly. "Thanks. I don't want to listen to you," Danielle said. "If you're not here to drink or eat, I would appreciate it if you left." "I can't," Eli said. "Did Michael send you?" "No, he didn't. I'm here on my own accord. I'm not a servant, you know," Eli said, his voice hardening. "I'm his friend," Danielle shrugged. "Whatever, I don't want to talk to you." "Please, Danielle, it's important." Danielle hesitated. She knew she would probably regret it, but eventually she gave in with a sigh. "Fine," she said. "You've got 2 minutes." Eli gave her a relieved smile. "Thank you." Jack hesitated. He looked between the two of them for a moment. Then he lightly touched Danielle's arm. "I'll in the back if you need me." She nodded and watched him walk away. When Jack had disappeared in the back, she returned her attention to Eli. "What is it?" "Michael is in trouble." Danielle's stomach clenched. It was an automatic reaction, and she hated herself a little for it. "What kind of trouble?" she asked, and she hated herself all the more for asking. Why did she even care? But she couldn't help it. She couldn't fool herself into believing she really did not care about Michael any longer, because in fact, quite the opposite was true. The withdrawal kind. Danielle frowned. What are you talking about? Eli sighed. He gave up drinking human blood, well, from the source, that is, he clarified. Stephen and I have been giving him blood bags from the hospital, but it's not quite the same thing. From what I gather, it's one hell of an adjustment. Is he sick? Very. Danielle winced. I don't understand. He said he didn't kill people. He didn't, Eli said firmly. He only took what he needed. Then why would he give it up? Eli hesitated. For you. Danielle blinked, her heart jumping to her throat. For me? Eli nodded. He's in love with you. He says he doesn't want you to be afraid of him, and maybe if he stopped getting his blood from people, you'd go back to him. Danielle was shocked. She had gathered enough information on vampires to know that what Michael was attempting to do was a gigantic challenge that most vampires were unable to go through with. I can't go back to him, she said, but she sounded unconvincing even to her own ears. What do you want from me? I want you to help him. You don't have to go back to being in a relationship with him, Eli said. But you're the only one who can make sure he doesn't fall into temptation. If he does, chances are he'll kill someone now that he's not used to feeding from the vein anymore. I can't. Look, Eli snapped. He's doing this for you. The least you can do is help him out. Danielle's eyes flashed in anger. The least I can do? She repeated, incredulous. I don't owe him anything. I didn't ask him to do this. Fine, Eli said. His dark eyes stared back at her with the same steel that shone in her own blue irises. But if he kills someone, it's on you. Have a good night. With that, Eli jumped off the stool and strode out of the pub, never once looking back. Danielle watched him go in utter shock. Her head was spinning with the information she had just been given. Michael had given up human blood for her. He was basically giving up himself, or rather, what he had become. And that's when something clicked. Michael had become a vampire. He had been made into one. He never chose this. Danielle thought about being stuck in a world you didn't choose for centuries, and she shuddered. Michael was trying to set himself free, and Eli was right. The least she could do was help him. Everyone has their demons. Michael had not looked his in the eye for centuries, and now that he found that it wasn't a pretty sight, except that at times, often, it was. His demons ran thick and dark and oh so sensual. They haunted not only his mind, but also his body. Constantly. Night and day, day and night. Every second, every moment. Some nights were better than others, and most of the time it didn't feel like the craving was tearing his insides apart any longer. But it was there, under the surface. Under his skin. Always. He constantly felt like he was standing on a precipice, and God forbid he looked into the pit. If he did, he would fall down and drink again. And this time, for the first time in almost 2 centuries, he would kill. He could only imagine Stephen's reaction if he were to start again. He could see the look of utter disgust on Eli's face, as if he had drained him. Most days, the thought of his friend's rejection, if he were ever to drink from the vein again and bleed somebody dry, was enough to help him suppress the instincts. Some nights were better than others, but tonight was not one of them. The vampire wanted to hunt. He wanted to feed, to kill, to taste. God, the taste. Michael had to pause in the deserted street and steady himself against a lamppost, because the memory was enough to make him dizzy with want. He could taste it warm, metallic, alive. Blood. How many people can actually taste their demons? Yes, but you're not people, are you? You're not even a person. You haven't been a person in almost 300 years. Michael was never one for self-pity, but he had found that one of the side effects of giving up drinking from the source was that all those questions that other vampires asked themselves every night of their non-lives came rushing in. All the doubts, all the self-loathing. Those were the times when he was most tempted. It would be so much easier to sate the hunger and silence the memories. But it was a luxury that he forbade himself to ever experience again. The stakes were just too high. The tremor that shook him next shook his whole body. Michael stumbled against a wall and let himself slump down until he was sitting on the asphalt. The rains had come to the Ojai Valley, and everything was wet from the day's storms. Michael landed in a pool he had not noticed in the spur of the moment. The water and mud drenched his pants. Perfect, he thought angrily. But he also welcomed the cold shock. It distracted him from thoughts of warmth. Warm blood on his tongue. Warm blood sliding down his throat. Warm blood filling his whole body. Warm blood making his veins pump and his heart race, even if just briefly. Warm blood making him alive. He could almost feel it rushing through him. Blood that did not belong to him, but that he had claimed for himself. Michael suppressed a scream and pressed his head back against the concrete wall, breathing heavily through clenched teeth. The craving had not been that overwhelming in nights, and it scared him. "Hey, buddy, are you okay?" Michael started. The imaginary drumming of the blood pumping through him was so fierce and loud in his ears that he had not heard the man approaching. He scowled, annoyed. Alleys just weren't what they used to be anymore. It used to be that you could do your business in peace, and everyone would mind their own business. "Go away," he managed to growl out. "I'm just trying to be nice." The man opened his arms in surrender, the whiskey sloshing audibly in the liquor bottle he was holding. But it was another liquid that Michael heard, blood sloshing in the man's veins. Over it all triumphed the drum of the man's heartbeat. Oh, God. Michael squeezed his eyes shut. Those sounds haunted him. How many people can actually hear their demons? Yeah, but you're not people. You're a predator, so claim your prey, claim the blood. Michael swallowed and opened his eyes. His throat was so damn dry. "You need a drink, man," the stranger said, taking a large gulp from his bottle as if to emphasize the importance of his words. Michael laughed, hoarse and slightly hysterical. It didn't sound human. "You have no idea." The man held the bottle out to him, and Michael shrank back as if scathing embers were being hurled at him. It was a small movement that only brought the man a few inches closer, but Michael could feel the warmth emanating from his flesh. He was so hungry. "Go away," he growled again. His fangs came out then. He had not meant them to, but he couldn't help it. His control was slipping, and so was his humanity. The man jumped back, the bottle falling from his nerveless fingers and crashing to the asphalt, shattering in a million pieces. "Your eyes. Go away!" Michael lunged at him, and he only managed to stop himself at the last second by some miracle. As they say, third time's the charm. The man took one last horrified look at him and ran as fast as his drunken legs would carry him. Michael fell back against the wall and into the puddle. This time the cold went completely unnoticed. He leaned his back against the wall and closed his eyes. It was so hard. How the hell did Stephen do it? Michael's hunger was a beast writhing inside him. "Michael?" Michael's eyes snapped open. Great, now he was hallucinating. "Michael, it's me." Something in Danielle's voice made him pause. He squinted at her in the semi-darkness of the road. "Danielle?" he croaked. "Yeah, it's me," she said again. She approached him warily, and eventually she was kneeling in front of him. She was even more beautiful than he remembered, which seemed almost impossible. Her almond-shaped blue eyes sparkled in the light of the lamp-posts. She reached out and tentatively put a hand on his knee. The contact was enough to jolt him back to something resembling himself. He blinked, astonished. "What are you doing here?" She gave him a small smile. "I heard you were in trouble." Michael frowned. "What's it to you?" "Are you okay?" she asked, ignoring his question. He shrugged. "Not really." "Did you really give up drinking human blood from the vein?" Michael groaned. "Yes, and if you ask me, it was a very bad idea." He tried to infuse irony in his voice, so she wouldn't know he didn't mean it, and that he wasn't about to go off on a killing rampage, despite his very obvious discomfort. To his surprise, Danielle chuckled. It was the best sound he had heard in a while. "Come on, let's get you out of the mud. You're soaked." "What's it to you?" Danielle had wanted to tell him that it was nothing to her, but during her drive through the deserted Ojai streets, she had realized that it was everything to her. Eli had told her Michael had taken to wandering the mostly empty city in the dead of the night, when almost no one was around. Danielle had thought she would start the search in what she knew to be Michael's favorite neighborhoods. She had not expected to find him this quickly, however. Presently they sat at the kitchen table in the cottage in the hills, nursing hot mugs of coffee. Danielle knew that was the safest place for Michael to be right now, and so she had driven him there. To her surprise, she found Stephen had acquired his balance back. Michael's brother had left them alone, giving them privacy, but Danielle knew he was probably listening closely from a nearby room for any sign that he should intervene. She didn't think it would be necessary, however. Michael was clearly hungry and in not great shape, but she didn't think he would hurt her. "Thank you," Michael said, finally breaking the silence that had settled over them. Danielle looked up at him. "For what?" "Coming to find me. You didn't have to." Danielle gave him a small, bitter smile. "I kind of did." Michael frowned. "Why?" Danielle sighed. She was reluctant to open up, but she also knew that more secrets were not what either of them needed. "I tried to get you out of my mind, but I just can't do it. I still love you, even knowing what you are." Michael stared at her in open disbelief. "Are you serious?" Danielle smiled. "Crazy, huh?" "Yeah," Michael admitted easily. Danielle shrugged. "Can't help it." She took a long sip of her coffee. "I did a lot of thinking these past few weeks, and I did some more after Eli told me what you were doing." Michael cocked his head to one side curiously. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking I want to help you. I want to help you give up drinking blood from the source, as you guys say." "Why?" "I told you. I'm in love with you. The past few weeks without you have been the hardest of my life, and if there's even one chance that we might be together, I have to take it." Danielle could scarcely believe the words that were leaving her lips. It was all true, however. Over the time that they had been separated, she had come to realize that, no matter what Michael was, she couldn't stand to be apart from him. Michael was staring intently at her. "Have you thought this through?" Danielle arched an eyebrow. "Didn't you hear me say that I've done some thinking?" Michael smiled and shook his head fondly. He sobered up quickly, however. "I mean it, Danielle. We're dangerous creatures. We try to do our best, but, well, you've seen what happens when we slip." Danielle nodded darkly. "I haven't forgotten," she said. "I will never forget, but I came to realize that you didn't choose this." A thought struck her suddenly. "Did you?" "No," Michael said immediately. "I didn't. Stephen didn't either." Danielle studied him carefully. She nodded, satisfied that he was telling the truth. "But I can choose, and I choose you, if you'll have me." Michael's green eyes had gone unbearably intense. "I'll have you," he said quietly. "I'll have you, Danielle. But what if— How about we deal with the what-ifs when and if they happen?" Danielle smirked. "How about you just kiss me now?" Michael did, and it was like coming home. Danielle gave in to his soft lips and sensual touch, and she let herself kiss her vampire, over and over and over again. The end.
If you want more paranormal romances like this, please, my love, be sure to subscribe to the Romancely YouTube channel. I look forward to spending more time with you. Subscribe and let's make it happen.